So, postcode, entity or an attribute. Okay, little poser for you, for your data analysts and programmers and software designers and people who think about data out there, business analysts. Entity or attribute? Pretty basic question, isn't it? And I guarantee probably 99% of the people who answer that question will be wrong, or at least wrong in some circumstances. Okay, and let me explain why. Okay, so this is a question I've asked my students a lot over the years, my database students, my programming students, my software design and analysis students. I've been trying to get them to think outside of the box and to think about data logically, and to, most importantly, don't go in there with preconceived ideas or preconceived ideas about how you think things must always work, because it's very dangerous. Okay, so let's just talk about some definitions first. So an entity, what's an entity? An entity is something about which you want to record information, something about which your organisation or your company or your client wants to record information. That's all an entity means. So you think about classes or groups or objects, and some examples there. So cars, people, products, songs, books, videos, computers, televisions, washing machines, they're all examples of entities. Okay, something about which you want to record information. Pretty basic, pretty easy stuff. This goes back to the really week one of data analysis, of any data analysis course you do, entity modelling or entity relationship modelling or anything like that, always starts with the definition of an entity. What's an attribute? An attribute is the various pieces of information you want to record about an entity. Or an attribute, a single attribute is a piece of information you want to record about an entity. So think about properties or characteristics or the details that help you identify or classify some entity. Okay, they're the pieces of information you want to record. Some examples: age, colour, suburb, postcode, email, phone, size, shape, name, address, you name it. Dimensions, weight, all sorts of things you might want to record. Okay, so that's the attributes and entities. Entities, something you want to record information about, and an attribute is the information you want to record about an entity. Let's look at some examples of those two together. So for a person, for a particular person, you might want to record their name, their date of birth, their address, their suburb, their postcode, their place of birth, maybe, and so on. You might want to record a whole lot of information about a person, and that's some of those that you might want to record. For a vehicle, which is another entity, you might want to record the registration number of the vehicle. In other words, the number plate. The VIN number that's on the engine or the chassis. Okay, there could be multiple numbers you might want to record. The manufacturer, Toyota, Honda, whatever. The date manufactured. So the date a particular vehicle is manufactured. We're talking about particular vehicles that we want to record information about. The colour, the number of passengers, and so on. There could be a whole lot of stuff you want to record about a vehicle. So person is the entity, and these are all the attributes. And vehicle is an entity, and these are all its attributes. And there could be many others. Okay, so these are just basic examples. So that's what that's what virtually all, certainly everyone I've ever seen, data analysis courses teach you. Suburb and postcode are always, and name are always attributes, and person and vehicle and so on are always entities. So we're mainly focusing on postcode here because that's a real life example I've got coming up. Okay, so you've got to be very careful here. Is postcode always an attribute? Could it be an entity? And this is the point I'm going to make here. And I worked at an organisation which was the organisation responsible for allocating postcodes and maintaining postcodes. And inside that organisation, there was Postcode Wars. They had many hundreds of IT people working for them, data analysts, programmers, analyst programmers, software designers, software architects, business analysts, And these people were split into two camps. There was 300 or 400 people on one side that said postcode is an attribute, it can never be an entity. And there was 300 or 400 people on the other side which said postcode is an entity, or it could be an attribute, or it could be both. Okay, and my first day at the company, I was working there as a freelancer, not wanting to put anybody offside, not wanting to put myself too out there too early, because I tend to be a quiet achiever. So I was just keeping a low key. But my very first day in the company, I was taken around and introduced to all the various teams. And the very first question they asked me was, each team, is postcode an entity or an attribute? And I said, well, it could be either. It could be an entity or an attribute. If you're in the organisation that needs to record information about a postcode, then it's an entity. If you're just recording postcode as an attribute of something else, like a person's address, then it's just an attribute. So it could be either. It could be an entity or an attribute. If you are recording information about something, it's an entity. If it's information being recorded about something else, a little piece of information, that's an attribute. Okay, so it's very clear. So postcode, certainly, in some cases, in some very rare cases, could be an entity or an attribute or both. Okay, so these postcode wars raged up and down the corridors of this company. I was only there 12 months, and boy, oh boy, they raged up and down there like crazy, to the point of people in certain teams would not even talk to or acknowledge people in other teams. Okay, if you're in a postcode as an attribute and can only be an attribute camp, you wouldn't even talk to the people that were in it could be an entity or an attribute or both camp. That's how bad it was. And the managers at this company let these wars rage on. Instead of getting everyone into a room and saying, listen here, idiots, it could be an attribute, it could be an entity and here's why, or it could be both and here's why. That's the end of it. We're not going to argue about it anymore. Instead of doing that, the managers let these wars rage on for years. Years and years and years. They've been raging on for years before I joined the company. It was the very first question when I was taken around to meet the teams on my very first day at the company as a freelancer, and they were raging long after I left. Postcode Wars. I'm not going to tell you the name of the company because I never do that. Everything, all the work and everything I hear at a client site is secret from then on. I'll take it to my grave. But I'm certainly happy to tell you the stories about it. I just won't mention anybody's names or the company name or anything like that. Okay, so what if you were the government organisation responsible for postcodes or some sort of entity that's responsible for pieces of data? Then you might need to record information about each postcode or something else. Okay, so for example, you might have the GPS coordinates. You might have the state, region or country the postcode belongs to. You might have a record of whether the postcode is valid or whether it's been issued or whether it's correct or whether it's available for use and so on, because postcodes get phased in and out. And you might also have the areas, towns, suburbs to which that postcode is valid or applies. Okay, so this is all data about the postcode. So postcode must be an entity if this is your company recording this information. It must be an entity. It might also be an attribute, but at least in some cases in your company, when you are recording information about each postcode, postcode is an entity. And so on. Now you might think, geez, you're getting very excited about this. Who cares whether it's an entity or an attribute? Well, it certainly matters, because the first thing you do when you're building a system is you must understand the data. And if you can't get the data right, you can't get anything right. Okay, so you've got to make sure you've got a correct handle on all the data before you can build any systems that work with that data. Otherwise, you can't hope to get it right. And of course, we've seen many spectacular failures in industry. $8 million spent, $20 million spent, systems being abandoned because they didn't do the analysis right. It all comes down to the analysis. So if you answer yes to any of those questions, then postcode is an entity for your organisation. Like I said, it might also be an attribute and for other entities, but it's certainly an entity as well for your organisation. So it could be both entity and attribute. And have different uses depending on the entities or systems you're using it in. Okay, so the conclusion, postcode can be an entity or an attribute or both. It all depends on the business or what your organisation needs to do or what your organisation needs to record or what your organisation is responsible for. as to what it is. Okay, but it could be either or both, an entity, an attribute, or both. What about phone number? And of course, the same thing applies. If you're the government organisation or a company responsible for dishing out phone numbers to people, you want to record whether the phone number's been allocated or not, because you don't want to allocate it twice or 3 times. You want to record whether the phone number's valid, whether it's one of your phone numbers. You want to record who the phone number's allocated to, if it's allocated, and so on. Okay, so in that case, phone number could be an entity or an attribute or both. Same with person's name. Even a person's name could be an entity or an attribute. For example, if you're the government department that deals with recording births, deaths and marriages, then name could be, a person's name could be an entity. You know, the person's got a birth date, an end date, when the person was named, what their birth certificate number was, and so on. There could be a whole lot of data about a person's name. Okay, so, and the same applies to many other pieces of data as well. So the golden rules: make sure you get the data right. When you're building systems, when you're doing business analysis, when you're doing data analysis, when you're doing systems analysis, when you're doing analysis and design, when you're doing when you're an analyst programmer, you've got to make sure you understand what you're doing. If you can't understand what you're doing, you can't get it right at all. And of course, if you can't understand what you're doing, then you can't hope to get it right. So understand the data first. If you can't get the data right, you cannot get anything right. Okay, so it all comes down to thorough analysis and keeping an open mind. Don't fall into the trap of always assuming something's going to be a certain way, because it might not be. Different companies do things in different ways and have different things that are going on, and different rules apply sometimes. Okay, so keep an open mind and think. Okay, so I hope this video was useful. Thanks for watching. This video might just save you from making some disastrous and really embarrassing mistakes in your career. I hope the guys that are working in that company, or the guys and the girls that are working in that company that believe postcode is always an entity, always an attribute, might watch this video and actually start to think. I did try and explain it very carefully. I was at that company for a year, and I did try on many occasions to just gently and try and explain to particular people in certain teams how postcode could be an entity or an attribute. And in every case, just when I was starting to convince people that it was the case, and they're going, geez, this guy's right. Just when I was getting people to think that, or when they actually did believe it and went back to the teams, then their teams would convince them back again that, in other words, they'd just be harangued and harassed and attacked until they believed the status quo again, which was postcode's always an entity, an attribute. Okay, so I couldn't change anyone's mind, no matter how much I tried, and it wasn't my job to change them anyway. It was the managers in charge. I talked to the managers in charge as well, and they just tried to stay out of it as much as possible. They thought it was a job for their technical people to sort out, and in a way they were right. It's just their technical people had blinders on, or half their technical people had blinders on, and they couldn't see past their own toes. Okay, so what my golden advice I've just given you might save you a lot of embarrassment and a really disastrous mistake or two in your career. So click the thumbs up if you enjoyed, and subscribe if you want to see more of my videos. Thanks for watching.